Some of you might recognize this particular area. This is Fortson Heights. This is Grant School on the right here. And what you see in front of you are a set of railroad tracks on the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Dayton Railroad. Okay? Later became the Cincinnati and Dayton Railroad. As a kindergartner, I had to cross this every day. Now, my grandparents, I had one set of grandparents who lived down here on 4th Street, and another set who lived down in Kentucky, right off the L&N. And it was always drilled into my head. Before you cross the railroad tracks, you stop and look both ways, okay? Which I did, despite the fact that this particular set of railroad tracks had not seen a train in 40 years, okay? What can I say? But this created the seed that became this particular book, okay? I was always curious about this railroad. My father explained to me this was part of the LC&D, which later became the Cincinnati and Dayton. And finally, after I retired from active work, I decided I wanted to look into this a little bit further. So that led me to researching this particular railroad. And I had to thank the late Jim Blount, who was the editor of the Journal News here in town. And he wrote about various columns about the railroads of Butler County. And his interest, or his article about the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, which eventually acquired the Cincinnati and Dayton Railroad, piqued my attention, particularly about the fraud aspect of this particular railroad. After I retired, I volunteered as a librarian at the Cincinnati Railroad Club, which is moved back into the terminal building in downtown Cincinnati a few years back. And I could never find anything written about the CH&D. And of course, I was curious about why that was so. And I asked a number of well-known railroad authors who wrote about railroads here in this part of the country, and they said, it's too complicated. There are so many twists and turns. There are so many weird stories about this railroad that no one could actually figure it all out. Well, being a certified fraud examiner, okay, I decided this is a challenge, okay? And that's what brought me about to writing this particular book. This is what it looks like. We have a few of them out on the in the lobby, and the deal I have with the Butler County Historical Society is that they get a cut of the proceeds of that particular book. So, telling a story that started 170 years ago is difficult. Everybody involved is dead. Okay, they're gone. You can't interview anyone. Okay, so you have to rely upon the written, incredible records that are out there. Well, there weren't a heck of a lot, to be honest with you. A good starting point, though, was a dissertation by a University of Cincinnati student who wrote it back in 1960, which we, by chance, happened to have in the Cincinnati Railroad Club library. It's a very good starting point. There were a few other good sources. The Interstate Commerce Commission investigated the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad and issued a report in 1917 about all the frauds that were going on with that particular railroad, along with the Père Marquette, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. News reports of the day could be dependable depending upon which newspaper you were reading. Really? Okay? And Basically, there were only a couple of sources that I would actually consider to be credible in that era. One was the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune. Now, you have probably never heard of the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune or any of its predecessors. But believe it or not, in the day, the city of Cincinnati was a major financial hub, particularly 170 years ago. If you remember, Cincinnati is called the Queen City of the West. We were pretty much, between us and Chicago and Indianapolis, the end of the known world in the 1830s, the 1840s. So you had a newspaper, what eventually became the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, that was basically pretty much similar to what we now know as the Wall Street Journal. It was a very well-written, very credible source for individuals. Also was a morning newspaper, which was eventually killed by the Cincinnati Enquirer during the start of the Depression in the 1930s. The Enquirer had a reputation for killing newspapers. They also killed the Post in 2008. Okay, the Hamilton Evening Journal. We actually had a journalistic giant in this city, Homer Guard. Homer was a founding member of the Associated Press. Not many people know that. Anything that you read in the journal, for the most part, was pretty much reliable. And of course, the online archives are available through Lane Public Library, Cincinnati Public Library. Those were a lot of the research areas that I was able to access. As an author, you can't do this alone. Kind of like a village. You know, you have to have a bunch of people helping you out. Chris Mayhew and the Otis Flinchball Collection. Chris Mayhew is the former president of the Cincinnati Railroad Club. He is also a former reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. And of course, I would needle him about that all the time. Dan Finfrock, who is here in the front row. Dan has an encyclopedia knowledge of railroads of this era. And I bothered Dan on more than one occasion for research material and photographs for the book. John Stewart, who is the person who frightens me most on this planet. He is the only guy that I consider to be a better researcher than myself. Okay, John is actually writing another book about the CH&D, which is probably going to be a few years down the road. Dave Orsey, most of you in this room have not heard of Dave Orsey. He is a well-known author out of Dayton, Ohio. He handles more northern Ohio and East Coast railroads. He has written a number of books. Keith Robbins, Steve Salomon, who are more experts in the northern Ohio area railroads. And of course, I can't have any type of a talk without having a Coke. Charlie Bogart, who has written primarily about railroads in Kentucky. He is the one who kind of taught me the whole process of physically publishing a book, how to use editors, how to use printers, et cetera, et cetera. The Butler County Historical Society has been a great help in researching this particular railroad, along with the Lane Library and the Midpoint Library up in Middletown. So let's talk about the founders of the CH&D. Just outside this room, there is a painting of this gentleman. His name is John Woods. John Woods was one of the early organizers of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad. Mr. Woods was an attorney here in Hamilton. He also was the Butler County prosecutor. He also was the Ohio Auditor of State, okay? And he was on the board of directors of the CH&D. He had various times was the president of the Eaton and Hamilton Railroad and the Junction Railroad. Now, the Eaton and Hamilton Railroad is on the other side of the 4th Street. Now, if you're as old as I am, and I think most of you, we're probably all in about the same category, you'll remember that there used to be a railroad that ran on 4th Street, okay? That was the original Cincinnati, Hamilton, Dayton Railroad, which was acquired by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. On the other side of, on 7th Street, I believe it was, that was, we will remember it as the Pennsylvania or the Penn Central, okay? Didn't start out that way. That was originally the Eaton and Hamilton Railroad, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about them later. But Woods was the president of the Junction Railroad and the Eaton and Hamilton Railroads. The story is told that Mr. Woods was very passionate about this area, and he wanted to see this town succeed. He was also behind the merger, so to speak, of Rossville with Hamilton. Some of you may know that Rossville, the other side of the river, was a separate community from Hamilton. Woods was one of the main backers of merging the two into the city of Hamilton, okay? Unfortunately, he died fairly young in life. He had gone out to the area by Millville. Was it Millville or was it, Dan, what was that community's name? John Woods. Yep. What is the community? I keep forgetting the name of the place. Before you get to Oxford. McGonigle. McGonigle, okay. He went out to McGonigle to settle a dispute between the contractor and the Junction Railroad, ended up with pneumonia and unfortunately passed away, okay? But he is one of the giants of this community and really doesn't get much recognition. The other founders of the CH&D, Henry Earhart, is credited with the suggesting of the idea of building a railroad between Cincinnati and Hamilton. Now, to go from Cincinnati to Hamilton, you only had really two different ways to do that. You could either take a stagecoach, okay, and that could take half a day or more, because a stagecoach is going to stop at every place that wants to pick up a passenger or to drop off a piece of freight, okay? The other way was to go on the canal between Cincinnati and Hamilton. You would get on a packet boat, and at the blazing light speed of 3 miles per hour, you would be transported to Cincinnati, okay? Now, that obviously didn't work too well. Lewis Campbell was the first president of the CH&D. He left in 1848. He found that politics was more his liking than running a railroad. He was elected to the U.S. Congress. Another giant is a gentleman by the name of Stephen Lahamadou. Lahamadou was the publisher of the Cincinnati Gazette. It was the first daily newspaper west of the Allegheny Mountains. And he is credited with raising an enormous amount of money to build this railroad. He would remain president of the CH&D from 1848 until 1870. Okay, a very long time in the railroad world. Other founders, Robert Shoemaker. He was an experienced railroad builder. He was hired in 1849 to construct the railroad. He had been the chief engineer of the Mad River and Lake Erie Railroad, which ran from Sandusky down to around Springfield, Dayton, and also the Little Miami Railroad. Now, the Little Miami Railroad was an interesting creature. It again started in Cincinnati and eventually ended up in Springfield, Ohio. It followed the Little Miami River on the east side of Cincinnati. It wasn't nearly as successful as the CH&D because there weren't that many communities in that rail line. Now, a fake news flash. We've all heard of fake news. If you go to the internet will tell you that one of the founders, or the founder of the CH&D, was a gentleman by the name of John Alexander Collins. He was born in England. And after doing a lot of research, at least a couple of days worth of it, I couldn't find where he was ever mentioned in any record of being a founder of the CH&D. It's one of those urban myths that has been perpetrated by the internet. But I can tell you that he is in fact buried up in Dayton, Ohio with this huge obelisk right here on top of him. So, but I can confirm that he was actually one of the engineers on the first locomotive that came up from Cincinnati to Hamilton in 1851. Now, as the road was being built, it faced a number of obstacles, okay? And one of them was something called cholera. Unfortunately, in Ohio, we didn't quite understand the sanitary needs. And apparently it spread like wildfire. And as a result, the construction on the road was stopped for some period of time. The other obstacle was the inability to get rails. Now, in 1851, we didn't have much in the way of facilities to produce rail here in the U.S. It was a fairly new phenomenon, okay? You had to import your rails from jolly old England. Now, the way they would do it is that they would sail across the Atlantic and come into the port of New Orleans, up the Mississippi River, and then up the Ohio River, and drop it off to Cincinnati. Unfortunately, the Ohio River wasn't cooperating, okay, at that point in time. Again, we didn't have all the flood control and the navigation infrastructure that we have today. When the river was running low, guess what? Those river boats weren't coming up from Louisville. So the railroad had to import rails from New York via Lake Erie and brought down by, of all things, the canal, which eventually the railroad put out of business. You would think the folks running the canal would say, oh, we ain't going to touch that. No. Another problem was the right-of-ways. Now, in this era, locomotives weren't particularly, how should we say, strong, okay? So if you wanted to have a train of any length, you typically wanted to have a roadbed that was fairly flat, okay? Now, coming out of Cincinnati, you probably have noticed, there isn't a lot of flat land, okay? And the best way to get out of Cincinnati, at least on the west side of Cincinnati, is through Spring Grove Cemetery. The problem with that is that the Spring Grove Cemetery was chartered by the Ohio legislature to be a cemetery, which means you can't have any commercial property or commercial business on cemetery property. So there was a long public relations battle between the railroad and the trustees of the Spring Grove Cemetery to allow rails to be built through the front part of the cemetery. Now, eventually they came to a settlement. I'm not sure if money passed hands, but my guess is in that era it probably did. And one of the things that the railroad had to agree to was to put a tunnel, okay, where the trains could go over top. And this is the main entrance. It's still there, by the way. Funeral parties could still come and have their funerals. even though the trains were going by. Part of the deal is that the railroad could not have any type of station or any type of switching facilities within the Spring Grove Cemetery property. Okay. Last thing you want to have happen is, you know, you're burying granddad, and you know you have a bunch of people hooping and hollering at the railroad station. So that was put a little bit further north. So the first CH&D train ran on September 18th, 1851. And the two inaugural trains from Dayton, Ohio met the two initial trains from Cincinnati here in Hamilton. Probably not too far from where the old train station used to be at. Okay? And regular passenger service at a speed of 30 miles per hour, much faster than you can go by stagecoach or by canal packet-boat, started in September 23rd, 1851. Okay? So, let's talk a little bit about where the CH&D went to. Started in Cincinnati, that was milepost 0, went through Commonsville, Spring Grove Cemetery, which is 7 miles away from the initial station in Cincinnati. The original station in Cincinnati was down at 5th and Bay Miller Street. You won't find anything down there now. It's all warehouses, and that stuff has long since been torn down. Carthage, Laughlin, Glendale, Jones Station, which is similar to modern-day Fairfield, Hamilton, Boozenbacks, Trenton, Middletown, actually West Middletown. The CH&D crossed Middletown on the west side of the Great Miami River. In that era, the city of Middletown, well, it wasn't a city, it was just a small community. It wasn't that large, and the decision was made that they weren't going to spend the money to build a bridge to get to Middletown because there wasn't expected that there would be that much business. They were clearly wrong, and at some point in the future they fixed that problem. From there to Poasttown, to Carlisle, Miamisburg, Carrollton, and then eventually to Dayton. What we see here is a map. This is from, I believe, 1853. And down here at the bottom is Cincinnati. Up here is Hamilton. Middletown, as you can see, is just on the other side of the river. And then Dayton is all the way up here. Now, when the railroad was first built, there was plans for another railroad going from Hamilton all the way over to Indianapolis. That was the Hamilton and Rushville Railroad. Now, that was being built or proposed being built as competition to what would become the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Indianapolis Railroad. That's the bridge that we see crossing the Great Miami down the street from here. The folks who were running this railroad, the Hamilton and Rushville, apparently didn't have enough money to finish it, and they basically kind of bowed out of the situation. The other road that you see here, this hadn't yet been built, is the Hamilton and Eaton Railroad. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, and it goes from what was the other side of where the old Hovind-Owen Rentschler building is at, all the way up to Eaton, Ohio, and then on to Richmond, Indiana. The third part is this right here, the Dayton and Michigan Railroad. Again, eventually will come under control of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton. It headed north to Troy, Piqua, Sidney, and all the way eventually up to Toledo, Ohio. Now, this is a rather unusual business arrangement. The Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad would share facilities and equipment with the Eaton and Hamilton, which I just showed you, the Junction Railroad, and the Dayton and Michigan Railroad as if they were one entity. The gentlemen behind the CH&D, again, were very civic-minded individuals. Okay? They wanted to see this area flourish, as it did eventually. If you look all around you here in this room, you will see Mosler safes and a number of other items that were manufactured here in Cincinnati. That is what their dream was, that this area, Hamilton and Cincinnati and Dayton, would be able to export products all across the world, which we did for many, many years. Okay? In fact, each railroad was a legally separate entity. And there appeared, as I mentioned, to be commonality of ownership between the four lines prior to 1859. We'll talk about 1859 in just a minute. And again, the whole idea was to promote the economic advantages of Hamilton, Cincinnati, and Dayton. All right. The CH&D main line was originally built on the west side of the Mill Creek Valley. Now, if you're familiar with Cincinnati, you probably have been down to the Museum Center, the old Union Terminal building down there. The rail lines in back of that, they were not part of the original CH&D. On the other side of the Mill Creek, that is the original part of the CH&D. This photograph probably goes back to, I think, maybe about the 1930s. Here is the Mill Creek on the right. This is a CH&D main line that would run up through Lower Price Hill and other communities. Now, there is still a little bit of that left, okay? If you want to be really dangerous, you can go down to Mill Creek Road right off of Spring Grove Avenue, and you'll find this set of original CH&D tracks. Everything north of there through Spring Grove Cemetery has been cut off. This was done back in the 1970s. And I believe portions of it south of there have also been cut off. The railroad has not gotten around to removing the tracks. If you ever were to go down there, I would suggest early on a Sunday morning, because this neighborhood isn't particularly nice, okay? And they're all going to be still sleeping and off. Okay. Now, I mentioned in the title of the book, the CH&D was a pioneer railroad. Well, why was it a pioneer railroad? Very simple. It was the first railroad in Ohio, built with private financing and without any type of government aid. The two previous railroads, the Mad River and Lake Erie and the Little Miami railroads, the state of Ohio would make loans to those institutions or those railroads amounting to about $717,000 in that era's money. That would be about $23.4 million today. CH&D would not receive any type of loan or stock subscription from the state of Ohio at all. And basically, it was capitalized with about $2.4 million. You can see right here. Much of it was in common stock. There was some debt in bonds and in floating debt. Floating debt is basically short-term debt, generally anywhere from 1 to about 5 years. Bonded debt is typically about 30 years in length. Okay. How much did it cost to build the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad? In 1852, it cost about $2.2 million to build this road. So there was a lot of money that had to be raised in that era. And a lot of the money was raised locally. And then once that money was raised locally, it was sufficient for Woods and Lahamadu to go to New York and sell bonds and stock to investors out of New York City. Okay? I always find it fascinating that the locomotive engines, I believe there were about 5 of them originally, totaled about a little less than $70,000 to buy those. I mean, I wouldn't buy probably a wheel set on a coal car these days. What did the CH&D carry? Well, the stuff that we need to live. The people in that era needed to live. Flour, apples, clover, seeds, eggs, beef, pork, lard, cattle, horses, hogs. My favorite, whiskey. Okay? Carried apparently a lot of whiskey. And I always find it fascinating when it comes to hogs. Again, Cincinnati was known as what? Porkopolis. Well, they didn't raise all those pigs in Cincinnati. You brought them from somewhere else. In this case, all up and down this railroad. Okay? That's how it was transported. And then the other side of it, bulk meat over here, that's going out of here as processed. Okay? Now, this is what the CH&D carried in 1913, 1914 in the way of goods on the railroad. And you can see that the list is much longer and more extensive and included a lot of manufactured items. Okay? Yeah, we have a lot of coal, and we needed coal for heating, for cooking, for manufacturing. And we had a lot of manufacturing in this town. You had Niles, just down the street here, Hoovenzo and Rentschler, Long and Allstatter. Down the street here in New Miami, back then it was called Coke Auto. They made Coke, they made pig iron, okay? All of that had to be transported. The materials coming in to make it, and then the finished materials coming out of here. So this kind of shows you how much impact the railroad had on this community. As far as passengers, okay, in 1856, the CH&D transported 352,451 passengers, all up and down their railroad, from Cincinnati to Dayton and points in between. That is a lot of stagecoach rides. That is a lot of canal boat rides, okay? People were transported literally in the matter of hours versus a half a day or more to get from point A to point B along this line. Now, it's interesting, the passenger revenue and freight revenue were roughly, freight and mail revenues were roughly about the same in 1856. When we get to 1913, you can see that the freight revenue, this is 1914, $7.4 million, and passenger revenue was $1.6 million. So freight was taking over because of all of the manufacturing that occurred in this area. And when you stop and think about it, if it wasn't for the railroad, a lot of us wouldn't be in this room, okay? Because our grandparents and great-grandparents probably worked at any number of these mills that made all these manufactured goods, okay? Now, was the CH&D profitable? Yes, it was, up until the very end. In 1859, it had a small loss. In 1877, it had a small loss. And in 1897, it had a small loss. The rest of the years, up till 1904, it was extremely profitable, which is why the robber barons wanted to get their hands on it. Okay? How large of a railroad was the CH&D? Well, it went from Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way up to Toledo. And then from Hamilton all the way over to, let's see, where is it? Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, Illinois is the capital of Illinois. And from Dayton, Ohio, all the way down to Ironton, and from Dayton all the way up to, Delphos, Ohio. It also had a line from Findlay, Ohio, all the way over to Fort Wayne, and a line from Dayton, Ohio to Union City. In total, about 1,038 miles of railroad added Zenith in 1903. Okay? It was a substantial railroad, and quite frankly, had it not been so poorly managed by the robber barons, it may have been the CSX today. Okay? And maybe we would have had a railroad headquarters town in this town today if it had not been essentially run into the ground by some rather greedy management and owners. Well, what frauds beset the CH&D? Well, there were a number of them. We'll go over a couple of them today. There were quite a few, okay? Otherwise, we would be here for dinner tonight. First one was Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. They were acting as the treasurer of the CH&D. The Henry Ives fraud of 1887, and the last one, the CH&D Syndicate of 1904. Now, the Ohio Life Insurance Company was a banking institution headquartered in Cincinnati, but had a branch office in New York City. It was capitalized with $2 million worth of capitalization. This is back in the 1850s. Again, an enormous amount of money. Basically, what happened is that some of the executives in New York City supposedly embezzled the money. Actually, what they did is they bought various railroad stocks on margin, meaning that they put the stock certificates up as collateral for a loan. Okay, and when the value of that stock went down, basically the capital of the institution had to be used to take care of the calls. Essentially, what happened is that the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company went belly up, and it is supposedly the seminal event that started the financial panic of 1857. Which lasted in this country until the start of the U.S. Civil War in 1861. Back then, you didn't have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or if you're old like me, you remember the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. Okay? So when you had a financial panic happen, basically everybody sold anything of value that they could to pay off loans, and there was very little, if any, investment in anything new in this country. This set off the decision by the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad to sell off all of their investments in the Dayton and Michigan, the Eaton and Hamilton, and the Junction Railroad. So at that point, those railroads were split off from the CH&D. Later, they would reacquire those starting during and after the Civil War. Let's see. Now, in 1877, again, we had another one of those recurring financial panics. The financial system in the United States, quite frankly, had not been set in place. That really wasn't done until the 1910s with the advent of the Federal Reserve System. But in 1877, the CH&D ran into financial problems as a result of that panic of 1873, and they failed to pay dividends to stockholders from 1873 to 1879. In 1878, the CH&D went into receivership. What they had done is they had acquired the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Indianapolis Railroad. It was formerly known as the Junction Railroad. This is the one that ran from Hamilton all the way out to Springfield, Illinois. And the Junction Railroad, as it was being built, took on an enormous amount of debt, which the CH&D had assumed as part of that acquisition. Again, there was some commonality of ownership between the CH&D and the CH&I, and apparently they argued as far as, gee, we want to reduce that debt amount or defer it, and the CH&I folks said that no, we don't want to do that. So the CH&D went through its first round of receivership. Okay? Because of these divisions, it appears that the owners of the CH&D and the CH&I factions came to the decision maybe it was time to sell out, which is what they did. They sold out initially to the Erie Railroad, and the Erie Railroad, as part of the deal to acquire the CH&D, made a guarantee to the stockholders of the CH&D. Unfortunately, the country went through, yet again, another financial panic. Okay? This time in 1885, I believe it was. So the Erie Railroad couldn't live up to their obligation. So the Erie, in turn, sold it to a gentleman, and I use that term loosely, by the name of Henry Ives, the so-called Napoleon of finance. He and his associates gained control of the CH&D in the spring of 1886. Henry Ives is a rather interesting character, somewhat of a pathetic character. But he had this grand vision of building a east-west railroad in the United States, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And part of that, he wanted to acquire the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Well, he started that process. He made various down payments and various promises to make payments to the Garretts, who owned the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And eventually, he couldn't come through. But the way he attempted to pay the Baltimore and Ohio is through unauthorized stock of the CH&D and some of the other railroads it controlled, the Dayton and Michigan in particular, and pledged various CH&D assets for loans. Ives had also acquired the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad, which operated a line from Indianapolis to St. Louis in competition with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, apparently, Ives made it known that he was going to make life very difficult for the Pennsylvania Railroad. What does the Pennsylvania Railroad do? They go to one of its great patrons, J.P. Morgan, okay? And they tell J.P. Morgan, this guy's going to make life rough for us. And Morgan did what Morgan typically did in that era. He called in the loans that he had given to Henry Ives. And basically, Ives, his whole organization went up in smoke. Okay? So at that point, Ives walks away, and the railroad returns to what I call local control. It, in fact, was not local control. Throughout the 1890s, the CH&D was owned by headed by Henry Shoemaker of New York City, along with Rush Taggart, and a gentleman by the name of Charles Fairbanks of Indianapolis. We also know him as Senator Fairbanks of Indianapolis. He was the U.S. Senator from Indiana. Now, the ownership stakes by insiders such as Shoemaker, Taggart, and Fairbanks, this wasn't public knowledge. This was not a requirement until the 1930s, when the Securities and Exchange Commission was established. So all this stuff is being done behind the scenes. The day-to-day management of the CH&D was done by a gentleman by the name of M.D. Woodford, who was the president of the CH&D from about 1890 or so until 1904. The CH&D, again, during that era was, for the most part, very profitable. Now, once the situation happened where Ives' loan was called in, this kind of piqued the interest of J.P. Morgan. And Morgan decided that, gee, this is a nice, profitable little railroad, and like some of the other railroads in the U.S., again, this is an era which railroads were being built left and right, and they were all competing for the same business, and unfortunately, most of them were losing money. This railroad, on the other hand, was making money, okay? So, Morgan basically takes a position in the CH&D. He says, I bought from, this is actually a ledger from Mr. Morgan's personal accounts. You can actually go to the J.P. Morgan Library online and look at his various investments in this time period. It's very interesting reading. So here, in what I believe is Mr. Morgan's personal handwriting, he says, I bought from Senator Fairbanks 18,000 shares of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton stock at $50 a share, with the understanding that in case within 1 year, as such purchase of the CH&D stock would increase in value, we would pay the difference in price on 12,000 of those shares to Senator Fairbanks. Now, if you wonder why there was so much shenanigans going on with robber barons and why some of the stuff that they did wasn't illegal, this is why. Basically, if you're J.P. Morgan, you have bought yourself the best vice president of the United States, outside of Spiro Agnew, that you could buy. Okay? Senator Fairbanks would become Teddy Roosevelt's vice president in 1904. Okay? Very influential senator. So any type of regulation involving financial transactions in the United States would have been handled by the U.S. Senate and various committees. Geez, what better way to stop that? Okay? What can I say? Again, because there is no requirement to report who owners of individual corporations are in that era, this was found in Mr. Morgan's ledgers. And it tells you how much stock is owned by these individuals in the CH&D. Mr. Shoemaker owned 28,140 shares. Mr. Zimmerman, who we'll talk about shortly, owned about 14,000 shares. Rush Taggart owned about 1,800 shares. Mr. Woodford, who was the president of the railroad, owned about 8,200 shares. And then Senator Fairbanks owned about, let's call it 23,000 shares or thereabouts. Okay. And again, this is a handwritten note to the same effect. It's just amazing that you could find such level of, how should we say, greed and graft in writing anywhere. But it's there. If you want to view it, all you need to do is go to the J.P. Morgan Library, okay, online. The last fraud that we'll talk about is the CH&D syndicate. Now, what is a syndicate? Generally, it's a group of individuals who get together to do a particular type of deal, similar to what we now know as private equity. So for all intents and purposes, this was private equity back in the day. Now, the CH&D syndicate would gain control of the CH&D Railroad in 1904. They also would gain control of the Paramarquette, the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Dayton, the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville, the Toledo Terminal Railroad, and all of the individuals behind those roads, the Pere Marquette, the Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, the Toledo Terminal Railroad, were parts of the CH&D syndicate. And they sold their stock to the syndicate for very inflated amounts. They also would transfer rights to a proposed bridge in Ashland, Kentucky, over the Ohio River, to the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad. And we'll talk about that here in a bit, for basically very token amounts. Now, let's go back here real quick. The syndicate essentially would load the CH&D up with an enormous amount of debt. And they would pay the proceeds of that debt to themselves as dividends. So essentially they enriched themselves by loading the CH&D with all of this debt, which I'll show you in just a moment. Now, why would they do that? Because they were going to unload the railroad on some other sucker. Okay? Yeah. And we'll talk about that sucker in just a minute. Now, we can see up to 1904, right before the CH&D was taken over by the syndicate, the railroad maybe had about $14 million in debt, okay? Which is bonded debt and other liabilities. In 1905, when the CH&D syndicate took over control of the railroad, we had about, let's call it about $56 million in debt. An enormous amount of money. Now, nothing had changed, okay? The railroads that were acquired were either marginally profitable or were horrible money losers. So you add all this debt on top of a railroad that parts of it were very well run, that were profitable, and other parts that were just an absolute disaster. You're basically asking for a bankruptcy. Okay? Now, an interesting point that I bring out in my book. The CH&D never filed for bankruptcy. Okay? Does anyone know the reason why? Mr. Frenfrock, you may not answer that question. The reason is very simple. The United States did not have a bankruptcy statute until 1898. Okay? So, they couldn't file for bankruptcy. They had to file for a receivership. So what is the difference between a receivership and a bankruptcy? Basically, a bankruptcy, as we know it today, you can discharge all types of debt, okay? In the era of a receivership, essentially you just pushed it further down the road. I go through about a 3 or 4 page section in my book that tells you the whole history of railroad bankruptcies in the U.S. So at this point, we have all of this debt that basically could not be supported by the CH&D. The ringleaders of the CH&D syndicate was Eugene Zimmerman, president of the CH&D, and a gentleman by the name of Harry Hollins. Harry Hollins was an investment banker out of New York City, and at various points in time, he had various partnerships with J.P. Morgan. Zimmerman was also part owner in the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad. Remember, I just talked about the CH&D had transferred rights to a proposed bridge in Ashland, Kentucky to the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton for a very token amount. Okay? Can we say conflict of interest? Yes, we can. Okay? Doing something like that today would probably end up the individual doing 5 to 10 making license plates somewheres, okay? And Hollins was also involved with Zimmerman in various other interests, I believe a coal mine. This is Eugene Zimmerman here, back when he was much younger. This is Mr. Hollins sitting in the chair, and he is having his boots shined by a servant. That's his daughter, along with the dog. Tells you a little bit about the individuals of that era. Now, the DT&I, which at that point was owned by Zimmerman and Hollins, ran from Ironton, Ohio, which is where, conveniently, the CH&D ended up in Ironton, Ohio, all the way up to Toledo and into Detroit and all throughout Michigan. This was a direct competitor to the CH&D and the Pair-Marquette combination. So when you have a group who basically had loaded the CH&D up with an enormous amount of debt and was going to sell it to someone else, now taking the proceeds of that sale and buying a competing railroad, okay, again, we go back to conflict of interest. Were they crooks? Yes. Okay. Did they break any laws? No. Unless, of course, it was 1934 and the advent of the Securities and Exchange Commission. What we had in the United States up until the Great Depression was a patchwork of state laws that essentially frowned upon this type of activity. But the problem is that if the railroad is in Ohio and the complainant, the person who has been ripped off, is in New York, you're going to have to, as a New York resident, go to an Ohio prosecutor who has been elected and probably, how should we say, owned by various Ohio residents behind the fraud. Are you going to get anywhere? No. Okay, you're not. And again, I tell the story in the book about how the CH&D tried to sue Mr. Ives, who was a New York resident back in the 1880s, again, under state law. Again, they couldn't do it. So, the big sucker now, the CH&D syndicate, is going to sell the CH&D, the Pair-Marquette, and all the railroads that it acquired to the Erie Railroad. How did that come about? J.P. Morgan arranged for an audience with the president of the Erie Railroad. And he tells him point blank, I really think you need to buy the CH&D. And this is when J.P. Morgan was at the height of his power. And if J.P. Morgan told you to buy the CH&D, guess what? You're going to buy the CH&D, which they did. And when the president of the Erie Railroad decided to tour, shortly after the sale closed, to tour the CH&D, he became informed of all the shenanigans, the debt, the transfer of assets to the DT&I. And he goes back to J.P. Morgan and says, you sold me a dog. And to J.P. Morgan's credit, he took the railroad back. Okay? Now, the problem is that J.P. Morgan is not in the business of running railroads or anything else. He is an investment guru. So he had to find someone to run the railroad for him until he could find another big sucker. And he chose the Erie Railroad to manage the road. Eventually, Morgan talks to the B&O Railroad and convinces them to buy the railroad. Well, why would the B&O buy the CH&D? This in red is the Baltimore and Ohio railroad system, okay, from the East Coast all the way over to St. Louis. and into northeastern Ohio, Pennsylvania, and down into Virginia and West Virginia. What you see in green is the CH&D. This fit essentially the industrial western Ohio areas and into Springfield, Illinois. The B&O thought that this would be a great traffic generator, which eventually it proved out to be, okay, for the railroad. And the B&O would invest millions in the CH&D. They would buy new locomotives, rolling stock. They would improve the track work and the efficiency of the railroad between 1910 and 1913. Okay, well, what happened in 1913? Yeah. Now, despite the millions invested, the 1913 Great Miami Flood would destroy that dream. The B&O literally financed the reconstruction of the CH&D. 1915, the B&O decided that, gee, we've got parts of the CH&D system that really aren't paying their way. Okay, the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western, the bridge that we see out here on the Great Miami, that particular part of the railroad was always a money loser. And the reason it was a money loser, even though it went from Hamilton to Indianapolis, there wasn't much in between. And we'll kind of get to that here in just a bit, in the way of traffic generation. Okay? What the B&O did is they essentially pared down the CH&D to what they now refer to as the Toledo and Cincinnati Railroad. From Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way up to Toledo. Essentially, the CH&D, through a perpetual lease, owned the Dayton and Michigan Railroad and kept the railroad from Dayton, Ohio, down to Wellston, Ohio. Okay? Everything else was sold off. Okay? Actually, it wasn't sold off. Basically, the B&O would go to the various bondholders and say, hey, your portion of the railroad isn't making money. You either agree to reduce the amount of money that we owe you, or we're going to hand you the keys. And that's what they did. They handed them the keys. What we knew as the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western, again, the road that ran from Hamilton to Indianapolis all the way out to Springfield, Illinois, they handed back to the banks. The banks would form a new railroad, and eventually that part of the railroad would become part of the B&O again in 1927. Okay? So, when we talk about the value of the CH&D to Hamilton, this is all of the online clients here in Butler County, or at least in this part of the county, on the CH&D. And if we look on here, you'll remember many of the names. Krause and Benninghofen, Estate Stove Company, H.P. Deutscher, Hamilton Lumber, Indianapolis Brewing Company, let's see, Bendel Margarant, Cullen and Vaughn, Long and Allstatter, Humans, Owen and Rentschler, Black and Clausen, Sterling Paper, Niles Tool Works, let's see, Miami Iron and Steel Company, Hamilton Coke Auto. Okay, those are all on the main line that ran down 4th Street. Okay. How much did the B&O spend to get control of the CH&D? About $43 million, after all was said and done. After all the debts that they paid off of the CH&D, after all of the money spent after the 1913 flood, and they ended up paying about $109,000 per mile of the resulting railroad between Cincinnati and Toledo, and then down to Wellston, Ohio. And then on July 27, 1917, the CH&D would disappear. Everything. The signs were painted over, all of the stationery, the tickets, all of that was changed over to B&O. It's as if the CH&D never existed. In a way, it almost seems like the B&O wanted to erase all memory of the CH&D because of all the travails that they went through, all the money they spent, having to rebuild stuff after the flood, and it's all gone. Okay? So the only thing that remains is a fading memory of a pioneer railroad. Now, unfortunately, a lot of photographs that I would love to have put in the book, I couldn't. And here is the Okeana station. This is what had been on the Cincinnati, Chicago, and Louisville. The Cincinnati, Chicago, and Louisville at one point for a period of months came under control of the CH&D. Okay? This is right at the time when the CH&D syndicate took over. The owner of the Cincinnati, Chicago, and Louisville was a member of the CH&D syndicate, but he kind of forgot to sign over the stock certificates to the CH&D before the CH&D went into receivership. So he survived a little bit longer. Eventually, this railroad went into receivership. This is the line from the west side of Cincinnati through Cheviot, across the Great Miami, down by Fernald, and ended up in Cottage Grove, Indiana. Okay, so it partially passed through Butler County. It's one of the a ghost railroad, so to speak. It's still in operation by the Indiana Eastern, but basically it's nothing like what it was before. Remember I talked about the Spring Grove Cemetery and not allowing a station on Spring Grove Cemetery property? Well, just north of there is something called Winton Place, and behind it is Chester Park, an amusement park. So just north of the cemetery is the CH&D's, one of their local railroad stations, and an amusement park. Woodsdale Park. I didn't give the Cincinnati and Dayton a lot of time here, but if you go out Canal Road, okay, you will see the remains of a canal there, okay, the Miami-Area Canal. On the east side of the canal is where the Louisville, Cincinnati, and Railroad used to be at. Remember the first photograph that I showed you about my grades or my kindergarten school? That line basically ran from High Street past where the Butler County Fairgrounds is, and then on the other side of the Miami-Erie Canal, the one that's all wooded, okay, all the way out to up to Middletown. Just off of there, probably close to where the park is at, would have been Woodsdale Island, which was an amusement park owned by the CH&D until 1913, and it was wiped out. Apparently a very nice place, early forebear of what we now remember as LaSwordsville. Okay, it had bowlings, alleys, restaurants, ball fields, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a place that people could go on Sundays, on the weekends, to get out of town, okay? But you had to cross I think it was 2 different bridges, and this was the actual station where you would have been dropped off. This is the other side of that bridge. Again, you went over the canal and then over the river to get to Woodsdale Island and Park. And this is the book. We have them out there in the lobby if you're interested. If you don't want to buy it today, we also have it available here at the Historical Society, or you can go to the Cincinnati Railroad Club website. We have it in our bookstore. I believe we're charging $50 for the book here. Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, okay.
We have any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.